introduction. The introduction is where now you introduce the story, introduce the character, you create the scene for the story. And it has to be interesting, because if it's boring and you're teaching kids, especially the young ones in PP1 in nursery school, they'll start jumping on chairs. I've ever had an experience where I was teaching kids, and probably I was a boring teacher, because then they started climbing walls and fighting and calling my name, teacher, 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 and I couldn't teach. So you have to make it interesting so that you can create a suspense. Like the child would want to know what is this story all about. And there are 3 examples of introduction. The first one is a question. You can ask a question. Like, for instance, if you're teaching the story of blind Bartimaeus, you can ask the children, assume that your children in my class. Okay, I'll ask you to close your eyes, children. Everybody close their eyes. I don't want you to see me. Close your eyes. Teacher Anne, close your eyes. Then I'll ask the child, the children, what can you see? And probably they'll say, I'm seeing darkness. I'm not seeing anything. So then you go ahead and tell them that, there was once a man who was blind, and he couldn't see anyone. He couldn't see his friends. He couldn't see his mom. He couldn't see his daddy. And now that would, to make the child connect to the story emotionally. Then you can also use an exciting portion of the story. Like, for instance, if you're talking about the triumphal entry, you can say, the man was coming to town, and everyone was so excited. Children were jumping around. Parents were telling their children to go and see this man. So you can use that as an introduction. And if probably you can even go to use the direct approach method, whereby you just tell the story directly. Like, you can go and say, for instance, if you're telling the story of crucifixion, you can say it was a dark night. It was quiet and dark, and everyone was asleep. But Jesus took. Okay, you don't say Jesus, but he took. You can say Jesus. He took his disciples, and they went to a garden to pray. And while they were praying, because the disciples were so tired, they fell asleep and they started to snore. Everyone was snoring, but Jesus was praying. So that is an example of how you can use the direct approach method to tell the story. Then you go to the progression of events. This is where you introduce the conflict, you introduce the story. The main character faces a challenge that needs to be solved, with a problem that requires to be solved. And during this place, this is where you teach. You introduce something called the central truth. The central truth, in simple words, is the message that you want to tell. This could be the story, the message for the unsaved child. You want to talk about the message of salvation. When you're introducing the problem, let's say the main character has a problem, you can say, this person had a problem. And if the child has not given their lives to Jesus, you can tell them, and you also have a problem. And this is the problem called sin. So that is when you introduce the central truth to the story. And ensure that when you're doing this, you try to read from the Bible at least 3 times, so that the child can know that this is God's word. If you don't read from the Bible, the kids will think that this is just like any other story. The story they are told in school about the hyena that talked. You want the child to know that this is the Bible, and the Bible is God's word, and God's word is true. So they can believe whatever is being told as truth. Okay, then afterwards you come to the climax, which is the most exciting part of the story. Finally, the problem has been solved. Yeah, the main character's problem has been solved, and he's okay now. His problem has been taken away. Then you go to the conclusion. This is where now you end the story, as in make it, let the story have a satisfying end. It shouldn't be like those Nigerian movies where you watch the story, then after it ends, you don't know what happens next. You go Googling. Yeah. So you have to conclude it nicely so that the child is satisfied and happy. Yeah, because of because they enjoyed the story basically.